Cool. Okay. We on? Yes. Good. Okay. First step, I want to say Patrick's book, Essential Upstream Kanban. If you went to Patrick's session, there's a link to an ebook that he's written about that, which he didn't have the link to. So if anyone wants that, there's a link to Pat's book. Go and download it. Secondly, why am I here? Why am I standing up here? My name's Brett Ansley. Recently been working as delivery director at a business called the App Business, which is the largest mobile-specific software development company in the UK. I've worked at a number of different large and small organizations, doing everything from delivery programs to restructuring and transformation programs. And I've been working in IT for about 22 years, which is scary because it tells me how old I am. And in particularly like agile methodologies for about the last 12 or 14 years. And this talk is kind of an exploration of how I got to start thinking about predictability and how I got to refine my thinking about what predictability means in an organization and how to achieve it. And I went to university at a time where they taught us that. And it was very much a waterfall style process. You start off with defining your data flow diagrams and your data entity relationships, and you map that onto a big process diagram, and then that process diagram becomes a system spec, and that system spec gets turned into software by a load of developers. And that's what we were taught. And I went on to my first job, and I tried that. And I remember I was working at Discovery Channel at one point and doing an implementation of a new piece of broadcast software. And the Gantt chart was so big that we had to print it on 2 sheets of A1 paper. And every week we would go through this Gantt chart to determine where we were at, update it, and then reprint these 2 A1 sheets. And that was a weekly task, which was painful and time-consuming and wasteful because it never really added any value. It essentially just gave us a reason for a meeting every week that was ever more painful. So that clearly wasn't working. So the next step was, okay, well, then I learned about Agile. I was actually working at a company called Rightmove. ThoughtWorks were brought in as consultants at Rightmove, and they taught me how to do Agile. And I thought, oh, this is so much better than the Gantt chart. I can do a burn-up chart with, I can plot my velocity, and that'll give me an idea of how predictable I am and be able to forecast something in the future. But I started to realize that actually, you know what, as much as we plot these things, the velocity is never actually exactly what we expect, and it never comes out to exactly what we thought, and we're always behind. So then we add little fudge factors, like we say optimistic velocity, optimistic scope line, pessimistic scope line, and it gives us this big hash of somewhere in that region that's approximately where I might be delivering something. But it didn't feel very scientific to me. It was kind of, I just add some numbers to velocity, I subtract some numbers to velocity, that gives me optimistic, pessimistic. It didn't feel like there was any basis of reality in that. It was just guessing. It was just guessing with a wider margin, right? And I started to look at some of the data. So this is weekly velocity frequency. So down the left-hand side, I have frequency. Along the x-axis, I have velocity points. This is 42 weeks worth of data from a project that I was working on. And I looked at that and I thought, well, actually, you know, maybe that tells me something about how consistent the velocity is or not. I've got a pretty wide spread, anything between 1 and nearly 20 days for a piece of work to be developed. So that means that if someone comes to me and says to me, how long is it going to take you to deliver this piece of work that is 100 units long, I can tell them that it'll take anywhere between 5 days and 100 days. Which is almost useful, but not really. So taking a look at that, and people said, well, what you'll see is that you plotted that for over too much time, because that's 42 weeks and you should see trends in that information. So you should only take the last few weeks for trend information. So I plotted that onto a scatter plot. I don't know about you, but I can't see any trends there. I mean, if you look at the last couple of weeks there, that's anywhere between 18 and 2. That wasn't particularly useful for me for forecasting either. So it's a pretty wide spread on that. So I started to read some more stuff about predictability and about how we manage predictability and what happens in the world of predictability. How do we get some system that we can use this data to get something better? And I came across reading of Little's Law. I actually started with some of Dan Vicanti's work, and then moved on to Don Reinertsen's flow book, and then some of David's books. Who here is not familiar with Little's Law? Anyone not familiar with Little's Law? Okay, Little's Law was written by a university professor. He was sitting in a coffee shop watching people moving in and out of a coffee shop and trying to understand how long does it take to get people to be served in a queuing system, basically. And so he came up with this law, which conveniently, when written like that, spells law. It's quite convenient. It just helps you remember. But essentially it says the number of customers in a system is equal to the average arrival rate multiplied by the average amount of time that they spend in the system. Okay? Which is kind of useful if you're trying to work out the number of customers in your coffee shop. But if we turn it around a little bit, we can say actually throughput, which is the arrival rate equals the exit rate. If we assume that the arrival rate equals the exit rate, then arrival rate, which is throughput, is equal to work in progress, which is our number of customers, is our work in progress, divided by cycle time, i.e. time spent in the system. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. Now we've got some model that we can work with that says that our throughput is equal to work in progress divided by cycle time. Thing is, I had that data. I knew what our throughput was, I knew what our work in progress was, and I knew what our cycle time was. So I didn't need an equation to work that stuff out. I could have read that off the charts that I already have. So how is Little's Law helpful? Little's Law is helpful not so much in our ability to calculate that equation. Little's Law is useful in the assumptions that underlie it, because the assumptions that underlie it help us to understand predictability. Little's Law governs predictability in queuing systems, particularly in a normally distributed environment, but actually the assumptions that underlie it help us to understand predictability in other systems as well. There are a few assumptions that underlie Little's Law. All measurements are in consistent units. Hopefully we take that for granted. If I measure cycle time in days, I also need to measure throughput in days, so the number of items per day. So all our units need to be consistent. Conservation of flow, which means that average number of things coming into the system is equal to the average number of things exiting the system, i.e. nothing dies in the system, right? Nothing exists for eternity in the system. Once it comes in, it must exit at some point. If you look at the flow in a supermarket, they open the doors, people go in, people go out, there's a work in progress. At some point, they close the doors. At the point that they're closing the doors, hopefully everyone's out of the supermarket. Yeah, so all work flows through to completion and exits the system. And the system is stable. Our stability is defined as the average average age of work in progress is neither increasing nor decreasing. That means that things are not going stale in the system. So the amount of time it takes us to deliver stuff today is approximately consistent with the amount of time it takes us to deliver stuff tomorrow. The age is not changing. And that's an important concept. If you think about your systems and your systems of work, how much is the average age of work in progress changing over time? Because if it's changing over time, then your predictability is decreasing. Now, it might be a good thing because we might be transitioning from work in progress taking a long time to work in progress taking a short time. And that's a good transition to make. But while you're making that transition, your predictability is lower. And Little's law is talking about how predictable our systems are, not necessarily how good they are at achieving an outcome. And so it's understanding the impact on these transitions to our predictability. And that's what I was interested in doing. And the total amount of work in progress is approximately the same at the beginning of our measurement period as at the end of our measurement period. Okay? So we've got a reasonably consistent work in progress across the measurement period. This is data from another team, also over approximately a year or just shy of a year. And what's interesting about this is at the start of the period, this was a team at Government Digital Services, which in the UK is a cabinet office department set up to help improve the way digital services are distributed or how digital projects are executed within the government in the UK. And at the start of this project, this was what most people would consider to be a high-performing Scrum team. This was a group of very experienced professionals working in a Scrum environment. And you can see in the lower regions of the graph the step increments classic of Scrum delivery. That's the 2-weekly cadence of Scrum delivery. And so you can see the step increments in that. Now, if you think back to Little's law, average work in progress at the start is similar to the same as average work in progress at the end. Those step changes mean that that assumption is not met. So that's breaking my predictability in the system. Over a period of time, we introduced work in progress limits, and we introduced a much more flow-based approach, and the average throughput increased. So the angle on that line is the throughput. The throughput increased over time. Actually, it was a 3-fold increase in throughput. But not only was what's interesting to me is not only was the throughput increased, but our predictability, my measure of ability to predict and forecast what was going to happen in the future was massively increased. Now this graph, I just quite like this graph because this one is that same team over Christmas. Okay, so middle of December, suddenly people start going away on holiday and everything grinds to a halt. Nothing happens through Christmas. So it's incredible how these little events in our lives, you can tell when the certain people went on holiday. So they're the business analysts. Just before they went on holiday, they built up a bit of a backlog so people could work on stuff while they were on holiday. And then everything just died, right? Incredible how these little events impact and affect our predictability. But we typically try and do forecasting using a very deterministic process. If I calculate the number of points and I have a burn-up chart, or I do some kind of planning poker, estimation poker, whatever it is, so I have a velocity and I have a number of points and I multiply them and I get a range and I get a date. Okay, it's very deterministic. X multiplied by Y equals Z. That gets us our endpoint. There's some problems with deterministic forecasting. As humans, we are less than perfect. Our brain is not a perfect processing unit. We have significant biases in our brain, stuff that's really hard to get away from. We have confirmation bias. Someone comes to you and says, I think this project will take about 6 months. Can you give me an estimate of how long you think it'll take you? About 6 months? Optimism bias. Most developers that I meet in my life are pretty optimistic. I don't know about you. I find testers are a little bit less optimistic. But, you know, developers are pretty optimistic people. And so I ask them, how long is it going to take you to do this piece of work? Oh, I can do it in a couple of days. No problem. Really? Yeah. How many have heard that one before? Familiarity bias. Familiarity bias means that when we are estimating a piece of work or something, we think back to the stuff that is most recent in our memory. And we tend to filter out stuff So if something's gone wrong 3 months ago and things have been going right for the last couple of months, we remember all the times where things are going right. We don't remember so well the things that went wrong further back. And so typically small things that happen infrequently but have a large impact on our predictability are forgotten by people who are doing the estimation. Blocking events, number of bugs on a story, these sorts of things, dependencies, and how painful dependencies are to overcome. Those sorts of things tend to be significantly underestimated because they don't sit in our fresh memory. They kind of recede back, and we have a strong familiarity bias. We underestimate a lot of things. So I started to look at my data on this team, and I thought, well, actually, you know what? My scatter plot is a little bit interesting. So this is now looking at cycle time. I started to look at cycle time. I thought, well, my scatter plot's looking a little bit interesting because I've got convergence. We can see the divergence introduced by Christmas, but before Christmas, we've got kind of a convergence of the cycle time data. And actually on my frequency plot, I'm going to move this because I keep banging it. On my frequency plot, I've got quite strong shape. And when I mean quite strong shape, I mean that it is a nice, like a nice, strong, almost normal, but with a nice long tail, right? So like a logarithm curve. So I thought, well, surely, I must be able to forecast off of this because this data is quite commonly used data shape, and it's something that we almost certainly can get some kind of algorithm to forecast off of that. So I started to dig deep into stochastic forecasting, i.e. using a statistical model to forecast the delivery. How can I build a statistical model that I can use all of that historic data, that wealth of historic data that I've got, to forecast how much I might be able to produce in the future? And I recognize that there are a number of factors that do this, and this is with reading some of the work by Troy McGinnis as well. So there's work in progress, there's the cycle time, there's bug rate of change of scope, team size, rate of change of the size of average stories. These are complex things to try and model. I can't just say work in progress times that times this equals an answer, right? This is not going to be a straight deterministic equation that's going to take these factors and spit out an answer to me. I need something that's a little bit more intelligent than that. So I started to use Monte Carlo simulations, and my first attempt at a Monte Carlo simulation was a very extensive spreadsheet that was very painful to run, took a long time. It couldn't model all of the factors, but started to give me an idea of what I could start to do with Monte Carlo simulations. And I built that over a period of time, and then I found Troy McGinnis's tool called Kanban Sim, if anyone has ever tried to use that tool before. It's a pretty comprehensive tool for building Kanban, for building Monte Carlo simulations. And it's got quite a steep learning curve, but it's pretty comprehensive in its ability to do it. So there are two ways that you can essentially do a Monte Carlo simulation off of your data. You can either do a throughput simulation, which is what Dan Vacanti's online tool, Agile Analytics, does, which is great for if you have a pretty stable system and you're not expecting to change the size of the team or the nature of the work that they're doing, then throughput analysis is a pretty good approximation. Problem with throughput analysis is it's impossible to model change. You need something more complex than just a straight throughput model to model change. And so Troy's tool allows you to model variations in the different parameters that you're using, which is quite cool. But my advice for building a model, if you are going to do this, is one, you need less data points than you think. But start really simple. And I'll take you through the steps that I went through, but it really is, starting simple is key. Because the point is that when we start building the model, we have no idea of how predictable or what our future capacity is. If I have a fairly rough model, I've reduced uncertainty probably by an order of magnitude. And then I can refine my model and so improve it. But that first step is the biggest reduction in uncertainty that I can gain. So by starting even with a fairly simple model, I can massively reduce my uncertainty, and then I can start refining it to narrow that down a little bit and understand my data a bit better. So starting simple is good. Layer on complexity, and then use history to refine it. So this is what my model ended up looking like, which is completely illegible on the screen. But I'll take you through that in a few little steps. Row by small row, probably not quite that bad. But I started with a relatively simple model to say, hey, you know what? I have a backlog of 30 items, right? Simple assumption, and I have 3 columns. My first one is a buffer column, and it has a WIP limit of 3. That's the stuff that's ready for dev. My second column is oh no, I only have 2 columns, awesome. Has a WIP limit of 5, and it's my development column. So all I have is ready for dev and dev. Once it's out of dev, it's done. Simple as that, right? What I've done for dev is I've got a distribution, so I've taken historic data, all the historic data from my spreadsheets, and stuck it in here and said, this is how my data is currently distributed when it goes through dev. Now run a Monte Carlo simulation. Who doesn't know what a Monte Carlo simulation is? Should I explain a Monte Carlo simulation? Yes, probably. Let me do that. A Monte Carlo simulation is where I take a set of data like this and I run through 1,000, 10,000, 20,000 different simulations. So, and I say, given this distribution of data, so I'll simulate a card coming through my system and it'll sit into the buffer, come into the buffer. I'll get three story cards coming into my buffer. Okay, so I've got a WIP limit of 3, so I can have 3. 1 will be pulled, 2 will be pulled, 3, 4, 5 until I reach my WIP limit. My buffer 1 will be restocked to 3. And then it'll look at the first card in this development column and it'll say, well, given this distribution of data, I'll pick a random point in that distribution so that I'm consistent with whatever that distribution, whatever that frequency distribution is. It'll always be consistent with that frequency distribution over a large number. But I'll pick a random point in that distribution and I'll finish that card in that amount of time. In my next card, I'll pick another random point in that frequency distribution and finish that one. And again, and again, and again. Thousands and thousands of times you run the simulation for 30 stories running through that board. And you take those thousands and thousands of simulations and you say, okay, well, where did they finish on average? Or what is the distribution of their finishing time? What is the distribution of the finishing time of those 30 stories through this system when I've run 10,000 random simulations? And that gives me a probability distribution frequency. So it gives me a probability distribution function. It gives me a curve, a nice curve. Then I can choose on that curve a point where I feel confident forecasting. I can say, am I confident forecasting at the 75% confidence level? So i.e., 1 out of 4 times I'll be wrong, but hey, if we're in an environment where we're relatively optimistic and willing to accept risk, 1 in 4 might be acceptable. Or do I take it to the 85th percentile, which is 1 in 7 times I might be wrong? It's a little more conservative. If I want to be super conservative, I can go to 90 or 95%. But because of the nature of a probability distribution frequency and probability distribution function and its long tail, the more certainty I want, the bigger each step is. So a 5% increase in certainty from 75 to 80% is this small. From 90 to 95% might be a lot bigger. Okay, so the more certainty I want, the more I have to push the time out. But it gives me the ammunition to be able to answer that question. With what confidence can I forecast my outcome? And I'll show you an example of this at the end. Next layer that I added on was blocking events. We realized that actually, you know what? Something that impacts us quite a lot is blocking events. We're dependent on certain other teams, we get blocked. So we put on a blocking event. And we get blocked in column 2. For every 4 to 10 stories that we finish, we get between 1 and 3 blocking events. And so once again, as a story comes through the simulation, it'll come to column 2 and it'll say, well, randomly, let me assign a blocking event to the story. Does it get one? Does it not? If it does get one, how long is that blocking event? It'll randomly assign a blocking event. Next thing I did, added scope. Hey, if you start with 30 stories, how many do you finish with? 50, 60, 70, 90, right? We all know what happens. Things happen. So for every story that we finish, actually on this one we added quite a lot of scope. For every story that we finish, we get between 2 and 4 additional stories. Defects. Nothing's ever perfect. So we add defects in there. In column 2, we get loads of defects, right? Next thing, we can add extra columns in here. We go from development to test, so to test ready and then to test. We've got a distribution for test column as well. So now we're modeling how it moves through development, how it moves through test. We're just layering on the complexity each time. One layer at a time until you build up a full model. Next super important step is to calibrate the model. Way to calibrate the model is to run it against history. If I were to rewind myself to 2 months ago and look at the next 30 stories that we had in our backlog, and I forecast that using the model, how accurate is it to what actually happened over those 2 months? Does it accurately forecast how long it took me to deliver those 30 stories? Yes? Great. Model's good. No? Need to adjust the model. What are the parameters that were incorrect in the model that I need to adjust to make sure it's correct? Continuously calibrate the model to understand how inaccurate it is and how it can improve its inaccuracy, or how it can improve its accuracy. And keep calibrating every time. It's not good enough. If you build a model, it's not good enough to assume that just because it worked last week, it'll work this week. You need to calibrate the model every single time it's used. Recalibrate every single time it's used. And the output you get is something like this. Okay? So the green stuff is between the 25th and 75th percentile. The red is max min, and it's saying to me, number of completed work items. If I want 80 completed work items, then that's the date it'll complete. And within a range of 25 to 75th percentile. If I want to be absolutely certain, then I have to push it out by a few days. Okay, so it gives me a range of confidence in when I can deliver stuff. I typically use the 85th percentile. That's something that I feel confident reporting off of. Always quote as a range. I never quote an absolute date. I try to quote always as a range. It's going to be in this range, 85% confident we can deliver in this range. And reducing the variance increases the predictability, improves your forecasts. Using this model, when I was working at GDS, I got the feedback that the teams that I was working with, I was doing 6-week forecasts. I was saying what we would deliver over the next 6 weeks. And I ran that simulation every week to give a refreshed and updated 6-week forecast. And I was told by some of the senior civil servants that the only teams where they trusted the 6-week forecast on what a team would deliver was the teams that were using this model. The rest who were doing their standard sprint planning and stuff like that, people had very low confidence in their ability to forecast. So it was a good validation that the model had gained confidence within the people who were using it. It was great. How did I try and reduce variance? I built a dashboard for myself like this. What I was trying to do was look for trends. how is my predictability changing over time? How is my average cycle time changing over time? Because if my cycle time is going up over time, that's an indicator that I'm getting less predictable. And so I was looking at a number of different measures of seeing how is my predictability changing over time, because that gave me something that I could action to try and improve it as much as possible. Things that I started to do was particularly interesting to look at the delta between the 50th and 85th percentile, because the wider that range, the less predictable I was. It's things that we started to do on the board. When a story went over the 50th percentile in cycle time, it was yellow, meaning that it would then drop, it would go to the top of the queue. Any queue that it was in, it would go to the top of the queue, because it was in jeopardy of exceeding the average, of exceeding the normal cycle time limits. Anything that went over the 85th percentile of cycle time would turn red, and that meant that it was expedited. It would move ahead of anything else, and any available resources were focused onto whatever was red on the board. And that started to massively squeeze up the cycle time and improve predictability. Instability impacts on forecast accuracy. So instability in the project team obviously affects forecastability. Excessively large work items clearly have a big impact. And artificial aging. Artificial aging is an interesting one. Artificial aging is expediting. If I choose to expedite an item, I am de facto choosing to artificially age all the other items that I have in progress. Now, I'm not saying that artificially aging is a bad thing. Look, we need to expedite stuff. All I'm saying is that it should be a conscious choice that when we choose to expedite, we understand that by expediting, I am choosing to decrease predictability. They are on a trade-off. You can't have both. I can't arbitrarily choose to expedite and have high predictability. So it's a good trade-off to recognize between those two things. And that forces the hand around, actually we should limit the amount of things that we're expediting, otherwise we run the risk of massively decreasing our predictability. And predictability is useful. But it is all about variance, right? So all of Little's law's assumptions talk to us about variance and managing variance. So it comes down to how well are we managing variance, therefore how predictable am I? And managing variance on your model, make sure that your assumptions are explicit. 85th percentile is a good point. And yeah, variance is introduced by instability. Now, variance is interesting because that was the end of this talk. And then a lot of people at the end of that would ask the question, well, how do you forecast when you have no historic data? Because this is all well and good if I have a set of historic data. And I started to work at a company, so when I was at the app business as delivery director. This is a software vendor or a software delivery company. Clients would come to us and say, hey, we have a budget of £1 million and I want you to do this amount of work with £1 million. Can you do it? Right? No historic data. We have never worked with this client before. How do we give them confidence in our ability to deliver, or how do we give ourselves confidence to understand the amount of risk we're taking on with that piece of work? How does that work? No historic data. It's all about variance. Variance is uncertainty. So really, it's all about uncertainty. How do I manage the uncertainty in my system? How do I manage the uncertainty of what I'm doing? How do I manage the uncertainty of my forecasts? And actually, why do I forecast at all? Why am I forecasting? Well, in my instance, I was forecasting to try and reduce uncertainty because I wanted some view on what was happening. And the reason I wanted to do that was to make better decisions. Right? If a client comes to me and says, I need this amount of work with this budget, I need to be able to look at our portfolio and say, I think that we are currently in a low risk situation with our portfolio. So I'm willing to accept a higher risk client. Is this a higher risk client or is this a lower risk client? I need to assess that. I need to be able to assess that risk. What I don't want to do is if I look at my portfolio and think, actually of the 10 clients that we currently have, I think we're at risk on some of these clients. So I'm below 85% confident that we'll deliver across that portfolio. If that's true, then I don't want to take on more high risk work. I want to be above 85% confident that I can deliver the next piece of work to balance the portfolio a little bit. Right? So I need to be able to make that decision. I need some data to make that decision off of. And I realized actually what I was doing was going through, and I put this together into kind of a generalized method for making decisions. And we'll step through each step in this process, but it's kind of a 5-step process for decision making with a few sub-steps, just to make it interesting. Okay, so we start by defining the decision. This is where I think, in my experience, a lot of people go wrong, and myself included. I was really bad at defining the decision that needed to be made. And I needed to get disciplined at making sure that I was being very specific about the decision that needed to be made. And in being very specific, I needed to have a clear statement of this is the decision I need to make, and this is the information that will allow me to make that decision. Okay? Quantifying the at-risk amount and giving myself a threshold, right? So, for example, I might say, got a new client coming in, need to assess the risk on doing that. I'm willing to accept third-party dependency risks on this project, so I'm going to sideline third-party dependency risks because I manage that through raids and through change requests through the project. But for this client, I want 80% confidence that I can deliver within the set time frame. Okay? So if I reach the threshold where I believe I'm 80% confident that we can deliver, then I think we should take this client on. If I don't reach that threshold, I don't think we should take this client on. Okay? Right. So that's my decision defined. Next step, I want to identify areas of uncertainty. What are the tasks, what are the processes, what are the tools, what are the practices that will affect uncertainty? What's uncertain in this system? List them all out. Just have a session, we go through and list out all the uncertain elements. Okay? And you could get a whole lot. The organizational ways of working. So this organization is a very waterfall organization and we're going to have to interact with them, and how are those interactions going to affect the delivery of this project? Scope, obviously, is the one we tend to focus on. The internal approvals process might impact us. There's loads of stuff, right? How short my feedback cycles are. All of this stuff is going to impact my ability to forecast the delivery date, or my level of certainty in order to do that. So I need to understand what each of them is, and then rank them. List the uncertainties by their impact. Okay. Again, something that typically in software projects we don't do very often. We have scope fixation. We always assume that scope is the thing that is going to impact the amount of time it takes us to deliver a piece of software. What do? We run these, new client comes in, hey, let's understand the scope of what we need to deliver. We run through, break it down into stories. We do story estimation on all those stories, add it all together, come back and say, this is how long it's going to take to deliver. Really? Because if you work in a highly regulated environment like a bank, it's going to take 3 times that amount of time to deliver. You might be, sitting in your perfect environment, you might be able to deliver it in 3 months. Sitting in a bank, it's not going to happen in 3 months. It's going to take you 9 months or a year, right? So what had the bigger impact on your delivery timescales? The software, the scope of the software you're delivering, or the environment you're delivering in? Okay? By prioritizing the impact, we can understand what's affecting our uncertainty, and then we can reduce uncertainty where it matters. Because typically, we get the most bang for buck in our first step in reducing uncertainty. The same as that first step in building a statistical model. That first step, the rough step, gave us the best bang for buck because it reduced our uncertainty the most, possibly by an order of magnitude. In the same way, the amount of effort that if we have one increment of effort in reducing uncertainty, that first increment will give us the most reduction in uncertainty. Every step thereafter is reducing returns. Perfect information is nearly impossible. I want to know 100% how long it'll take you to deliver this piece of software. Okay, in order to answer that question, I will run the software project 10,000 times. I will take the 85th percentile of that, and I'll give you an answer. But it'll be a very, very expensive way of determining 100% confidence on delivering this project, right? It's a crazy question to ask. We can't give you 100% confidence. The number of steps, the amount of effort you put into reducing uncertainty should be directly related to the amount of money at risk. If it's a £100,000 project, I don't want to spend £50,000 reducing uncertainty. If it's a £50 million project, I'm quite happy to spend £50,000 reducing uncertainty. Because £50,000 reducing uncertainty now means that I don't have penalties at the end of the software project that will far and away exceed £50,000. Okay? Much better to spend that money up front. Amount of money is spent reducing uncertainty. So that comes back to that decision statement I said. So if our amount at risk, if the value at risk is high, it governs how much time I spend reducing uncertainty. Direct correlation. So I rank the items. Now in this one, because I specifically want to use scope, I'll put scope at the top of the ranking list, but typically I find scope is not necessarily the top one in my list. But I want to specifically use that as an example. So now we come to how do we reduce uncertainty? How do we reduce uncertainty? Well, for me, there are three steps of reducing uncertainty. Three steps are select a model, select a technique that you're going to use. How am I, given the type of uncertainty that I'm going to reduce, what is the best way for me to reduce that uncertainty? Then I'm going to calibrate that model somehow. And then I'm going to execute it to understand how I reduce uncertainty. So first thing, select. Given that it's, well, there are a number of different techniques, right? I could run a spike. And we typically think of spikes as technology spikes. So I do some development to reduce uncertainty in the technology space. I could just as well do a process spike. I want to understand how the change process works in this organization. So let me introduce a change and run it through the steps of change in the organization to see how long it takes. Because that's pretty important to me. I want to know how long the change feedback cycle is, because that directly impacts my ability to deliver stuff. How long does it take for me to get approval to do something? I can run a spike on that. I can send an approvals note through, see how long it takes to come back, right? That's a pretty useful spike. If that's your biggest area of uncertainty, that's a pretty useful spike, right? So I think we constrain spikes to technology spikes, or actually we could use them more widely. They're a very useful tool. Decomposition's a great tool. Anyone give me an idea of how many piano tuners there are in London? How many piano tuners work professionally in London, do you think? Any guesses? 5. Okay. 10. Anyone have any certainty about how many piano tuners there are in London? No. How many pianos are there? Excellent. Good question. So how would we determine how many pianos there are? Research. What percentage of the population do we think might have a piano? As a guess. 1%? 10%?
Number of pianos sold.
Sorry?
Number of pianos sold.
We could look at the number of pianos sold. Good. How would we get to the number of pianos sold?
Looking at the figures, at the vendors' figures.
Okay, so we could do some research. Yeah. Some research into the vendors' figures, yes. If we don't have that to hand, how else might we know?
number of complaints for the loud
Number of complaints for loud music being played, yes?
How many vendors do you have?
How many vendors do I have? So how many people are selling pianos? Because if I know how many people are selling pianos, I might be able to calculate how many pianos are sold, right? Because I could take a guess. If I look down the yellow pages, I look piano shops in London, and I have 100 piano shops in London, I could probably guess, you know, how many pianos do I think I need to sell in order to support a piano shop? Okay. So if we took a guess of saying, hey, let's say 2% of all Londoners had a piano, possibly a reasonable guess. 2% of Londoners have a piano. We know that there's 7 million people in London. So 2% of 7 million. Simple maths, we can do that. So we know how many pianos there are in London, more or less, at a guess. Now we know approximately how many pianos in London. How does that help us to get to the number of, what's the next step to get to the number of piano tuners in London? How often do we tune pianos? Okay, how often do we tune pianos? Depending on how often you use it. Yeah, possibly. Once a year. Let's say we tune pianos once a year. We know how many pianos we have, we tune them once a year. How long does it take to tune a piano? How many pianos could a piano tuner tune in a single day? Right, including travel?
4.
4. Let's go with 4. Okay? Now you see, with that maths, I could work out how many piano tuners there are in London. And actually I've done this with groups, and from massive uncertainty, we get to a number typically between about 1,000 and 2,000. And if my research bears out, as Yellow Pages research, there are about 1,200 piano tuners in London. Okay? So that's an example of decomposition. We've decomposed a big problem into a series of smaller problems where we could identify the answer to those problems, or more or less, and give ourselves a little more confidence about the answer. So we massively reduced our uncertainty by decomposition. It's a really good technique, really powerful technique that we underutilize. We use it when we break stuff down into stories. We sometimes underutilize it in other problem-solving areas. It's a really good one. Monte Carlo simulation we've been through, estimation we're going to go through, research we talked about, like doing some research on shops and stuff. Testing is a good one. Try stuff out, user testing, things like that. Historical comparables, like do I have anything in history that I can compare this to reduce my uncertainty, and some kind of data analysis. Okay, so I'm going to do estimation because I want to show you estimation. Basically, that's my reason, and it's a good one, I think. Okay, so first thing, I need to calibrate. How do I calibrate my estimators? Typically, we do this very badly. We throw a load of stories at developers and say, estimate them. And then we assume that what they said was true. We've done no calibration whatsoever. So, you're going to need either a phone or a piece of paper and pen. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. All of those questions have numeric answers. And I want you to give me a lower bound and an upper bound, where the lower bound, where you think that the actual answer is somewhere between the lower bound and the upper bound, such that you have 90% confidence that the real answer is going to lie somewhere in the middle. So if you're really uncertain, you'll have a wide spread. If you're really certain, you'll have a narrow spread.
In the middle or in the range?
Somewhere in the range. I don't care where in the range, somewhere in that range. It must fall somewhere between your lower bound and your upper bound numbers. Okay? 3 questions. In 1938, a British steam locomotive set a new world record by going how fast in miles per hour? Okay, so miles per hour introduces another factor of uncertainty. How do I do the conversion between kilometers and miles? How fast were steam engines traveling in 1938? I don't know, but I could probably do some guesses and figure that out, and I could probably give myself a range, right? So what's your range? In 1938, British steam locomotive set a new world record going how fast in miles per hour? Give me a lower bound. What would be the slowest speed record in 1938? Upper bound. What's the fastest I could imagine a train going in 1938? Okay? Number 2, how many inches long, inches, again, uncertainty, how many inches long is the average business card? We all know how, we've all seen business cards. How long are they? In inches. Lower bound, upper bound. Somewhere, so you're 90% confidence it's in that range. Okay? Last one. The internet, at that time called ARPANET, was established as a military communications tool in what year? The internet, at that time called ARPANET, was established as a military communications tool in what year? Low bound, high bound. Okay, answers. But before I give you the answers, I forgot to bring my dice again. You can imagine I have in my hand a fair 10-sided dice, numbered 0 to 9. Okay? There is a 90% chance that if I roll that dice, I will not roll a 0. Yes? Now, if I asked you to bet, and you can either bet on me not rolling 0 on my dice, or you can bet on your first answer on that question. This dice is perfectly, symmetrically, 90% confidence that it won't roll a 0. Are you going to put your money on my dice? Are you going to put your money on your first answer? Who would put your money on the dice? Who would put their money on their answer? Who would not be able to choose between the dice and the answer? Right, so if you would put your money on the dice, then you're probably overly pessimistic with your, or overly optimistic. Your range was too narrow. You're optimistic about your own confidence. If you would put your answer on, if you would put your money on your answer, you were too pessimistic. Your range was too wide. If you're like, well, I don't know, could go on either. I wouldn't really be fussed. I think they're both about the same. That means that you got your 90% confidence in your mind. What we're doing here is assessing your mental capacity to understand your uncertainty. Okay? Answers. First answer, 126 miles per hour. Okay? Second answer, 3.5 inches long. Third answer, 1969. Okay? Now, who got all three in their 90% confidence? Excellent. Good. Couple. Who got 2 inside their 90% confidence? No, it's a good number. It's a good number. Who only got 1 inside their 90% confidence? Who didn't get any inside their 90% confidence? A few. Okay, right. So what does that tell us about our own understanding of our confidence? So what I would normally do is run a series of these with a team of developers. We'd do 10 questions. The expectation is that you get one of those questions outside your tolerance, because that means that you're about 90%, right? 1 out of 10, 90%. If you run a series of these, then talk about techniques to improve our own cognitive ability to recognize our confidence. And then we'd go into an estimation session. So calibrate the estimators, then run the estimation session. Calibrate, run. Calibrate, execute. Calibrate, execute. Okay? By the way, if you got 3 is really hard to draw any kind of statistical inference out of, but if you got none out of 3, you're probably pretty low down on in terms of the over-optimistic about my understanding of my uncertainty. You're probably right on that list of over-optimistic. So those are your developer types. Testers typically score higher. Right, then we execute our model. And I ask the developers to do the same thing. Give me a 90% estimate. On each story, give me a 90% estimate. The shortest, the longest time it'll take you, give me a 90% estimate. I want a 90% range. And I can use that 90% range to understand how I adjust for risk. And I sum up the small numbers, sum up the large numbers. I get get an idea. I could potentially, there's a 5% chance I might do it in this time. I have more 95% chance that I might do it in this time. This is a wildly complicated spreadsheet that I built for myself. And what it is down the left-hand side, I've got cycle time. It takes the cycle time set and gives me the Weibull curve for that cycle time test. Anyone know Weibull curves? Weibull curves are used in manufacturing as mean time to failure. They were originally designed for. As it turns out, mean time to failure and mean time to completion, actually not too bad sometimes. They can be quite similar. So if you look here, the blue curve is the model. So the model predicts this is again cycle time and frequency. And it predicts that I should look something like that. If I was going to model, that's what I would look like. But the green ones are where I'm different from the model. That's my actual data. I can start looking at where am I not. The model would be perfectly predictable. My variance from the model means I'm not perfectly predictable. I'm not very well predictable. So now I need to look at those areas where where I have variance from the model. And I need to understand, why does that variance exist? Is it because there's a different class of service? Is it because there's something happening in the team? Is it because there was a change? What's causing that variance? If I can understand that, I can come closer to the model. I can become more predictable. It's about managing variance, right? So I use that to kind of try and increase my confidence on those things. And one of the reasons I do that is so Weibull curves, each Weibull curve is numbered. Typically in the projects, so I've looked at all the projects at the app business over the last year and some of the historic ones where I have data for them, and I've plotted them all to get a Weibull curve across all of them. They range in Weibull numbers from 1.2 to 1.9. This is a curve for a 1.2. See how low it is, how wide it is. Okay, that's what we're looking at. What's its height? What's its width? Width tells me variability. Highly variable is very wide. 1.2, so 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, 1.7, 1.8, 1.9. Okay? See the increase in predictability as we go up the numbers. So that's why that spreadsheet is so useful. I can take a set of data, I can throw it in there, I can get a Weibull number for it, and I can tell you how predictable it is off the back of that Weibull number. Okay? The first one, my 90% confidence interval, is that wide? That's 1.2. 1.8, that's my 90% confidence interval. It's an order of magnitude in reduction of predictability. Oh, in uncertainty. Order of magnitude of reduction in uncertainty. Okay? You want to narrow that curve as much as possible to increase your predictability, if predictability is important to you, which it is to me. Last thing I do is I assess. Okay, so I've gone through this. I've defined my problem. I've identified a load of uncertainties. I've ranked them. I've reduced the uncertainty in the highest ranking uncertainty. And now I need to assess, have I sufficiently reduced uncertainty to move on and say, I can make this decision. I've sufficiently reduced my uncertainty to make this decision with confidence. If the answer is yes, then make the decision. I don't need to do anything more. If the answer is no, then I need to go back. What are the other areas of uncertainty that I've identified? How do they rank now? Given that I've reduced uncertainty in what was the highest ranking one, re-rank them. What is now the highest ranking uncertainty? Reduce uncertainty, assess, and go through again. And we can continue to go through this loop until I have sufficient confidence to be able to make a decision, at which point, make the decision, right? So there's the general model. That's it. I think that's pretty much time. It will take a quick question. Go on.
When you
were talking about the 85 percentile.
Yep.
That would provide you with a date if you're using the Monte Carlo simulation. But then you suggest that we use a range.
Yes.
Where do we take that range if we're talking about an 85th?
Yeah. So I'll typically take, rather than, if I'm communicating to stakeholders, rather than taking a specific number and saying I'm 85% confident, I'll typically say I'm between 85 and 90% confident that it will deliver between these two dates.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. But I typically take 85 as my lower bound, if I can, because people fixate on the lower bound, right?
Yeah.
Always.
What was the name of the train? Was it the Mallard or the Flying Scotsman?
I don't remember.
Okay, I'll Google it.
I Googled that for you.
Cool. Thank you very much.